Good morning. We are indeed going further in our study called Why God. Next week, we're going to be dealing with the question of evil. And I hope you come back as we look at that subject. I want to share with you again the purpose of this series. We're going to talk about deep questions, hard questions that skeptics ask. And so I'm coming at this a little bit differently. You know, my journey was I was a skeptic and who came to Christ through apologetics or Christian evidences. And so this journey I'm passionate about because it's my journey. But I want to point this out to you. Last week we had a couple of folks going, hey, you know, Jim, you didn't really use the Bible very much last week. And you're right, I didn't. And I'm not going to this week either. Because here's why. If one of the things that used to bug me about Christians is when I would ask a question, they would open up this book and the Bible, and they would start reading to me from the Bible. Now, if you're a skeptic, they're going, why are you opening up? I don't believe that book. Why would you use that book as an authority when I don't think it has any authority? Does that make sense? And so what I'm trying to do is say, no, before we get here, there's reasons why this book has authority. Once we've established it has authority, then we can start quoting from it. Make sense to you? So I know that some of you already believe in this book. Great. But this series is to equip parents and people, to challenge them, to find the answers, to be ready for an answer. To disciple our kids so that they're ready for the challenges they're going to face in colleges. And this last week, I got a text from a parent right after last weekend's message saying, hey, my daughter had to watch in a middle school here in town, had to watch a video that said that the Bible is wrong and unintelligent people believe in what the Bible has to say about how we got here, and science has proven the Bible wrong. And I said, send me the link. So I watched the link and thinking maybe they were just being a little bit melodramatic, and guess what? They weren't. And so the question is, what do I do about that? And again, we're not saying withdraw from society. We're saying get ready and go in with light, right? We don't need to be ashamed. We just have to have answers. And I'm glad this parent was aware so that they could have the conversations. And now we've got to be equipped, and that's the purpose of this series. So last week, I talked about why I believed in God. And just very briefly, let me review the 4 answers I gave. The first answer is called the cosmological argument, and it says that the universe had a beginning. Science has now proven that the universe has a beginning. Duh. Right? But you need to understand that for about 150, 200 years, they rather than believing that God created the universe, they believed in what's called a static universe system or a steady state theory of evolution. They believed that the universe was eternal. There was never a time where it came into existence. Rather than having a God that's eternal, a first cause that speaks the universe into existence, the universe itself is eternal. Well, along with the Hubble telescope and Einstein and much of the science that in the 19th and 20th centuries has disproven the static universe theory or the steady state theory of evolution, the universe had a beginning. It had an origin, which then we have to go, well, where did it come from? And so that leads to the cosmological argument that says the universe itself is designed. There are 15 constants we've discovered so far that have to be exactly as they are for life to be possible in the universe. The probability that just one of them is exactly where it is like, for instance, dark matter, it's 10 to the 120th power, okay? That means that the probability of just one being where it's supposed to be for life to exist is so high that it's almost impossible. In fact, we don't even have a number for 10 to the 120th power. Now, each one of the 15 constants has like probabilities, so you have to stack probability on top of probability. The universe could not have just formed in such a way by accident. Random natural processes could not have formed in such a way that life is possible. Scientists, by use of the cosmological argument, have said, no way. Many of them. Not all, but many. The probability is nil. That led to the second argument I used, which is called the biological design argument. Now you have to look at the planet Earth and you have to look at life. What makes life? What's the probability of life coming to existence on its own? And when we look at the design argument, we found at the cellular level, technology based on information, little machines that are unexplainable and could not have happened by random, undirected processes. The more intelligent, the better our equipment gets, the more we discover design. Last week I showed you a video on that. If you've missed this, then grab it. Third issue I used was the consciousness issue, or the consciousness point. Scientists are saying you can wire a computer and you can program it so that it does certain things. It takes information and design to create a computer. But even if you design it, even if there is an intelligent designer like a human being who creates the computer, there is nothing about the computer that leads to consciousness. In other words, consciousness is not something, or awareness of self, awareness of the spiritual realm, the ability to say I, to think, to not go according to programming, but according to choice, free will. All of this is unexplainable biologically. Consciousness proves there's something beyond just the complexity, the organized design of natural organic material. When you start to look at consciousness, scientists can't explain it, and I gave you that argument. The last one is the moral argument. Scientists have discovered that there's a core of shared truth in all human beings. As much as people say what's right for you is right for you and what's right for me is right for me, they may say that, but there's something wired within us that says there is right and there is wrong. And that right and that wrong doesn't just work. In other words, evolutionists can say, well, it's wired into you as random, undirected Darwinian evolution, wired into us over many generations accidentally, this shared use of right and wrong, like instinct. Deer have instinct. The problem is that many of the things that human beings do, they hold to even when it doesn't preserve their life. In other words, even if it costs them their life, they'll do it, which would therefore not be the product of survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest means that the processes will be designed so that you can survive. An absolute right and wrong, even if it costs you your life, does not help you survive. It leads to your extinction. And so the moral argument is another reason why I believe in God. Now, I want you to know this, that science itself is still debating this whole issue. And one of the problems I have with Christians is they'll go to their universities, they'll watch the National Geographic Channel, they'll watch all this stuff, and they'll go, well, everybody believes in evolution, therefore evolution must be true. And then they'll embrace it, and they'll go, well, things like, well, maybe God used evolution to create the world. Well, okay, maybe he did. But before we jump on the bandwagon saying he did, you need to understand that most of what scientists tell you on National Geographic, most of the scientists that are handpicked out of a whole bunch more scientists to make their case, listen, there is still so many things being debated, and these guys have fake science just like we have fake news. If you believe that the other side, whether you're liberal or you're conservative, the other side's maneuvering, manipulating facts and picking and hand choosing to create, scientists do the same thing. And then we elevate certain scientists to make the point, and then we say everybody believes it. No, there is still much discussion about this. Watch this.
Evolution is a fact. It's a fact which is established as securely as essentially any other fact that we have in science.
Richard Dawkins is so confident that evolution is a fact and that therefore God doesn't exist that he has devoted his entire life to spreading the evolution gospel.
I'm an atheist with respect to the Judeo-Christian God because there is not a shred of evidence in favor of the Judeo-Christian God. It is completely right to say that since the evidence for evolution is so absolutely, totally overwhelming, nobody who looks at it could possibly doubt that if they were sane and not stupid. So the only remaining possibility is that they're ignorant, and most people who don't believe in evolution are indeed ignorant.
But the people I spoke with weren't ignorant. They were highly credentialed scientists. So there had to be something else going on here.
So you think the whole theory of evolution is false, or just certain parts of it?
Well, again, evolution is a slippery word. I would say minor changes within species happen. But Darwin didn't write a book called How Existing Species Change Over Time. He wrote a book called The Origin of Species. He purported to show how this same process leads to new species, in fact, every species. And the evidence for that grand claim is, in my opinion, almost totally lacking.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
And what was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology, and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Well,
but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God.
You know, I want to show you the scientists themselves rather than give you a straw man and beat it to death. I want you to understand that Richard Dawkins is talking about directed panspermia. It's been around for a while. It was laughed at when it first came out, you know, that there is design. And I want you to notice he would recognize there's design. Within genetics, within molecules, within cells, there's design. He acknowledges that. The question is, where did it come from? And what is he saying? He's saying, well, we may have a situation in which a galactic group of beings became so intelligent and so powerful that they seeded life on planet Earth. They designed it. Now, again, let's say that was a possibility. What he's really saying is that Darwinian processes, Darwinian evolution by itself cannot create life. Therefore, it needs possibly a helper. And so he says maybe an alien. But my question then would be, if Darwinian processes aren't enough here and we need an alien, then if an alien existed, Darwinian processes wouldn't have worked there alone, and there would have needed to have been an alien situation for them as well. And how far do we push this back? Does this make sense to you? Here's some observations. Not only do I believe that what the Bible says about this, that the earth and the universe itself screams out knowledge and speaks forth truth about God. The universe reveals, we call that natural revelation. The universe itself, nature itself, reveals a creator. When you look at something that's designed and created, it tells you something about the one who created it. That's called natural revelation. I want you to know that I believe that natural revelation actually tells us what kind of a God we're talking about. It doesn't just tell us that there is a God, it actually tells us what kind of a God, and we can actually eliminate certain religious views based on science itself. For instance, if the universe came into existence that hasn't always been, then Buddhism and Hinduism cannot be true. You say, why? Because they believe in pantheism. The universe and God are one. The universe, if the universe and God are one, and it hasn't always, the universe itself hasn't always existed, then we have a problem. Science actually says, no, we had a universe begin, therefore God and the universe cannot be the same thing. If it took a God to create the universe, they can't be the same, therefore Buddhism, Hinduism can't be right. Make sense to you? I think that science tells us that the deistic God can't be correct. Deism believes that we actually had a couple of our founding fathers in America that were deists. Here's what deism says, that God created the earth, but then he stepped back from it and just let it go on its own. And it's not he's not a personal God. He's more like a force. And I don't believe that, because if consciousness exists, meaning that the ability to have relationship, to choose, to have awareness, and if moral law is embedded into our hearts, then therefore the Creator must care about relationship and he must care about right and wrong, which would exclude deism. But beyond that, I believe in not just natural revelation, I believe in special revelation. And for that, we have to ask this question. If there is a God who is this intelligent, this powerful, this caring, this relational, then is it probable that he actually had some interaction with his creation? And if he had some interaction with his creation, then that interaction would be credible. That interaction would be provable. That interaction would make sense. And for that, we have to go into religion. There are about 1 billion different religions. Which religion actually fits with science? Meaning, for instance, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He spoke it ex nihilo, the word in the Hebrew, into existence, meaning there was nothing, then there was something. That fits with what we see in the universe. It has to actually fit with natural revelation, but it would also be provable historically. There would be evidence for it. So therefore, I look at the Bible, just like I did. I want you to imagine if I had a religious book, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, all the Book of Mormon, I were to lay them up on the table, and they all claim they speak for God. They all claim they get their message from God. Well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each book and I'm going to go, is there any evidence that it fits with what we know about science, but also it fits historically. It's historically provable. We don't go, in history, a book is old, therefore it must be true. We would study to know whether or not it was historically accurate. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually look specifically at the story of Jesus, but I want you to know I believe the Bible's true for a variety of other reasons. First, if it took a miracle to create the world, then I believe that miracles would be a part of the story of God interacting with human beings. There would be miracles, but they would be credible miracles. There would be things that we could actually look at and go, did that really happen? That fits with the Bible. Not only that, the Bible is unique because when it comes to evidence, historical evidence for the existence of the characters within the Bible or within the story, we actually have evidence archaeologically that the Bible is right about what it says about history. And you may not have ever heard about this, but let me just give you some examples. This is Dr. Merrill Unger. He's an archaeologist. Listen to what he says about the archaeology of the Bible. Old Testament archaeology has rediscovered whole nations, resurrected important peoples, and in the most astonishing manner, filled in historical gaps. So when the Bible says there's places and events going on, we can look at archaeology and discover that it's true. For instance, Israel, Jerusalem, the cities around it, Jericho, the walls falling down. We have stories of God interacting. We can go there and see where some of these events are provable still after thousands of years. How does that compare with, like, let's say the Book of Mormon? Brigham Young University will tell you that they have never found the land described in the Book of Mormon in North America. In fact, they go so far to say, some of the scholars of Mormonism say that God took away the land described in the Book of Mormon and took it up into heaven, and he will not give it back until we just believe. Now, I want you to think about that. See, we don't have to do things like that with Christianity. The land's here for us to believe in the first place. We don't have to just believe and then we'll get evidence. God doesn't ask us to check our brain at the door. Is that making sense to you? When it comes to prophecy, the Bible is the only book in history that actually describes prophecies that happen hundreds of years later. So, like, for instance, the Bible will actually tell you in the book of Daniel that the Greeks are going to come, that the Greeks are going to break into 4 kingdoms. The book of Daniel was written hundreds of years before Darius, the Persian king, even was born, and yet it names him by name, and then it happened. Prophecy in the Old Testament's the only religious book in history where we actually, you guys just read the books, you know, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. These books were written in time and place. A writer would write it, then 100 years would go by, and then exactly what the writer wrote did happen, and we have an account of both in history. There's no book like it. But beyond that, the character in the Bible that catches my attention and changed my entire life was the story of Jesus. If Jesus is provable, if the story of Jesus actually happened, if he did these things that it says he did, then he is unique in history. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you why I believe that this book is true concerning Jesus. And then next week we'll be able to go into this and go, all right, now I can actually believe what it says. But I'm going to give you 5 reasons or 5 attacks that the secular world makes on the story of Jesus, and I'm going to answer those attacks. The first attack that they make against the story of Jesus is this: it cannot be true because there are miracles in it. And we know that miracles do not happen. That's the attack, and that's based on the Darwinian evolutionists who say we live in a closed system. There's nothing outside of materialism. And so they say, any book that has a miracle in it, we know it's false because there is no God. Why do we believe there is no God? Because Darwinian evolution proves there is no God. You see how it's circular reasoning? Darwinian evolution does not explain the miracles. In fact, it points to miracles. Science points to miracles. We cannot explain how something came from nothing unless there's a God that has always existed. Always. He is the first cause. He wasn't created. He's always existed. The universe is not the first cause. It was created. God is the first cause by his very nature. He is spiritual, physical. He has the power to do what he wants. Miracles are possible. So when you say the New Testament can't be true because it says that Jesus walked on water, and we know that's not possible, I would say to you, it is possible if Jesus is God. Miracles are possible, and I believe science even proves that we have to have a miracle for life to exist. Does this make sense to you? Yes. So they use science to try to disprove the New Testament. The second argument they will make is that the Jesus story isn't actually true because Jesus never was a real person. I want you to know that this is the most famous argument or the most prevalent argument in universities today. It's called the Christ myth argument. And here's what they're saying. They're saying that Jesus didn't exist that early Christians wanted to formulate their own gods, so they borrowed from the Egyptian god stories, they borrowed from the Roman and Greek god stories, and they saw that in the story of Horus, that some of the Horus story is in some of the Jesus story, they'll say, and therefore we know Horus came first, so Jesus didn't exist. The people took part of the Horus story, or part of the Mithras story, or one of these old God stories, and they created Jesus. Now, I want you to know that this argument is prevalent, but it's the dumbest argument on the planet and the easiest to destroy. First, when people say stuff, one of the things that drives me crazy is people don't check their facts. All you have to do is read the story of Horus and read the story of Jesus and know there are no similarities. There's nothing that's the same. All you have to do is look at Dionysus, the story of Dionysus, and go, there is no similarities. Somebody said that and went and took off with it and went, yep, there's similarities. No, read the stories first. All you got to do is Google it or go to gotquestions.org or any of these things, and they will show you the story of Horus, show you the story of Jesus, and let you figure it out. There are no similarities. Secondly, the Mithras story is the most famous of all of them right now. And the Mithras story is very much like the story of Jesus. And so what they're saying is that the Jesus people stole the Mithras story. Here's the problem. The Mithras story didn't get started until 150 years after Jesus. It was the Mithras story that stole the Jesus story. All you got to do is look it up. In fact, the early Christians were going, hey, you took our Jesus and made it into a different religion. All you got to do is look. But more than that, I don't need the Bible to tell me stories of Jesus. We have 10 writers who lived at the time of Jesus who tell us Jesus was a real character. Non-Christian government officials and historians who were not Christian who tell us Jesus was a real person. Let me just give you some examples of this. This is Tacitus, a Roman historian. He's writing about Christianity in the 1st century. Here's what he says. Nero substituted as culprits. Nero burned down Rome, and to get out of it, he blamed it on the Christians. And punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty, a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. So I want you to notice that they're saying the Christians did it, and it was founded by Christ, and Christ was underneath Tiberius. Pontius Pilate had him killed. There's no question about whether Jesus lived or not. Josephus, a Roman and Jewish historian, wrote this. Remember, this is 1st century. Ananias convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. All right, so I want you to notice this is a Roman and Jewish historian saying Jesus is a real character. Josephus goes on to say this. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he is one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused of men, or by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. These are historians that are saying Jesus really did live. He is a historical character. Let me just give you this example. This is F.F. Bruce, professor at University of Manchester. He's an historian. Listen to what he says. Some writers may toy with the fancy of a Christ myth, but they do not do so on the grounds of historical evidence. The historicity of Christ is as axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar. It is not historians who propagate the Christ myth stories. In other words, folks, historians know Jesus was a real character, and if you're going to say Jesus didn't exist, you better get rid of Caesar Augustus. You better get rid of most of what we know about history. Make sense to you? The third attack that they give is that the New Testament wasn't actually written by the disciples of Jesus. The disciples of Jesus didn't write anything, they'll say, and they'll say the story just developed over time, but later on somebody said, they wrote what's called pseudepigrapha. It's a writing with a false name on it, and they started passing it out. But here's the problem. The early Christians who lived at the time of the disciples tell us where they got their writings from. Here's what they tell us. This is Papias, who lived in the first century, and he says, the elder John used to say this also. Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately all that he mentioned. So Matthew Mark, wrote for Peter, one of the eyewitnesses. He goes on to say, Matthew recorded the oracles in the Hebrew tongue. Irenaeus goes on to say that the writings of the apostles are so secure that false teachers are using them as a jumping off point to create their own religions. Now here's my point. It always drives me crazy how somebody 2,000 years later thinks they know something better than people who lived at the event itself. That's called revisionism, historical revisionism. The early church knew where they got the stories from, the actual eyewitnesses themselves, which is why when you go to the New Testament, they tell you, we pass on to you not stories we made up, but that which we have seen and heard we pass on to you as eyewitnesses. The early church, the church for 2,000 years has known this. The fourth argument that these people make is that the story just developed over time, that the actual writings were copied and copied and copied, and now after 2,000 years, the story has changed so much that we don't have the same story anymore. Here's the problem with that. We actually have almost 2,000-year-old copies that say the exact same thing our copies say today. We have copies found all over the face of the earth, starting at 25-year interval, 25 years after the actual event. We have copies found. This whole telephone game thing that people say the Bible's been changed, no. We know it's the same story. How do we know it's the same story? Well, let me give you a couple of reasons. First, non-Christians who lived at the time tell us the same story that we have. In other words, if the stories change, for instance, what they'll tell you is that the early Christians didn't think Jesus was the Messiah. Well, then why would Josephus say, hey, the early Christians who believe in this Jesus say he's the Messiah? If that happened over time, then why are the people who lived at that time telling us the same story? Go back to this for a minute. This is Flavius Josephus, and I want you to hear what Flavius Josephus actually said. I want to break it down. Listen to this. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats. I want you to get this for a minute. Some people will say the miracles didn't actually happen. Those stories just got bigger like legend over time. If that's not true, or if that's true, then why is a Roman historian at the time of Christ saying that Jesus, why would he say Jesus actually did miracles? If that story developed over time, and it wasn't until 300 years later that they said Jesus did miracles, why in the first century are they saying Jesus did miracles? Go a little bit further. And he was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. If they didn't think he was the Messiah in the first century, why is a Roman historian hearing about this Jesus who's the Messiah? When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. Listen to this. On the third day, he appeared to them restored to life. If the story grew over time that Jesus rose from the dead, then why are the Roman historians who weren't even Christians telling us the early Christians say he rose from the dead? Do you understand what I'm saying? Not only do we have early copies, but the story hasn't changed. In fact, folks, before I would ever even read this, I wanted to know what other non-Christian historians wrote about Jesus, and I don't need this to say Jesus is a historical character who they claim did miracles and who they claim rose from the dead. I don't need the Bible to prove it. But I have the Bible. All right, well, let's go beyond that. Not only has the story not changed, but I want you to notice this, that early Christians were so sure that the story came from the apostles. They were so sure that Jesus did the miracles. They were so sure that he rose from the dead. They were so sure that the story didn't change, that Christians were giving up their life for Jesus and for what his disciples said. It's not like today. If I convince you that Jesus is the Son of God and you decide to give your life to Jesus, somebody might think you're silly. Your parents may not like you because you left this religion or that religion that you had before, but you're not going to die for your faith. Back then, it's much more like it was in Pakistan right now. If you decide to follow Jesus, then you are legally bound to go down to the government and change your status from being a Muslim to a Christian. From that moment on, the government will treat you differently, the people will treat you differently, and very likely you will die for your faith as an apostate. That is what it was like at that time 2,000 years ago. They were so sure that the disciples were telling the truth that they themselves gave up their life. There was so much more at stake. They gave up their life. Not only that, you may not be aware of this, but the early church Christians wrote letters to each other, much like you. Have you ever written a letter and said, hey, I'm just holding on to the promise in Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Have you ever written a letter? Did you know that we don't even need the early manuscripts of the Bible to put together the Bible? We can just take the writers of the early Christians, quoting scripture. We can put the entire Bible together just based on the letters that Christians wrote to each other 2,000 years ago, which again tells us the Bible is the same today that we've had for 2,000 years. Here's what Norman Geisler says. The quotations are so numerous and widespread that if no manuscript of the New Testament were extant, the New Testament could be reproduced from the writings of the early fathers alone. The Bible hasn't changed. The story of Jesus didn't grow. Well, the last argument that they will make is this, that the writers of the New Testament, the disciples, actually lied and created a religion so that they could get powerful. Now, they have a reason that they believe this, because if you investigate religions as a whole, most every religion that's ever been started, the founders gained something for starting the religion. For instance, Muhammad, he became the most powerful man. He gathered an army. He was known as the prophet. He could speak the word and have you killed. He could send his army where he wanted. He had 10 wives that we know of. In fact, he created a tithing system where 10% of all that they took from people around them, he actually got. He became incredibly wealthy. Joseph Smith, Mormonism, he had 35 wives that we know of. He became the prophet. He became so powerful that he had his own army as well. And he actually ran for the presidency of the United States. He had the best house, and they all surrounded him and gave him whatever he wanted. That's all historical. Just go look it up. Buddha, we don't know what to do with Buddha because Buddha didn't actually write anything or say anything that we have records of. The way we came to know anything about Buddha was 500 years after he supposedly lived. A monk was going into a trance, and Buddha supposedly came to him in a trance and said, I lived 500 years ago. Here's my teachings. And 500 years ago, I gave up my property and my wealth, and I actually just went around teaching, and now you're going to be my spokesman. Listen, first of all, how would we even verify any of that? Secondly, even in the story, Buddha gave up his stuff, but he became renowned, and wherever he went, people followed him and listened to him, and he became powerful. See, when you look at religion as a whole, whether it's in our time, David Koresh, Jim Jones, when people start their religions, they gain incredibly for what they did. But Christianity is different. When you look at the New Testament writers, what did they receive? What did they teach? Well, first of all, they taught things like this: he would be first, must be last, and be the servant of all. They taught, take your possessions and sell it and give it to the poor. They taught either don't get married, or if you do get married once to one woman and no other, and divorce is not God's idea. When you start to look at why a person would want to create a religion, they didn't gain any power from it. They didn't get any wealth from it. They were, in fact, when they tell about what they got from it, listen to what Paul actually says in his account of what his life was actually like. Listen to this. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He's speaking about the fact that other religious leaders, they got all kinds of good stuff for being religious leaders. Not so with him. He says, I have worked much harder, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country. You see, he had been a powerful, religious, wealthy, rich leader, and he gave it all up when he saw Jesus raised from the dead, and he became a person who went around preaching that Jesus was the Messiah of the Old Testament, came in person, and he eventually was beheaded. He was given the opportunity to shut up and disappear, and he said, I cannot do so. I have seen what I have seen. Every one of the writers of the New Testament gave up their lives. Luke was hung. James the Great beheaded. Philip scourged, then be crucified. Matthew run through with the sword. James, the brother of Jesus, beaten with a fuller's club to death. Matthias stoned. Andrew crucified. Mark dragged by horses in 4 different directions, torn to pieces with signs on the horses that said, this is what happens to all Christians. Peter was crucified, Jude crucified, Bartholomew crucified, Thomas run through with a spear, Simon crucified, Barnabas hung, John banished onto an island. Listen, every writer of the New Testament gave up their life. Now you might say, well, people die for their faith today. Muslims will take a bomb and put it on themselves and blow people up because they believe in the jihad and they believe they're going to be in heaven with 70 virgins. And you're right, they believe it. I believe they believe it or they wouldn't do it. Would you agree? But there's a difference between somebody who lived 1,400 years after the event and somebody who lived at the event. The question isn't whether somebody will die for something they think might have happened. What did Muhammad do? Did Muhammad die for his faith? What did Joseph Smith do? What did Buddha do? We don't know. The New Testament writers were actually there to see whether the miracles really happened or not. They were there to see Jesus walk on water, if that was true. They were there to see Lazarus raised from the dead. They were there to see and hear the voice from heaven that said, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." They were there to see Jesus heal a leper who had no hand, and now there was a hand there. They knew whether it happened or not. And they were so convinced that they gave up their life, and not only their life, but the life of their children, their wives, the people they told the story to. They knew they would die, and they told them anyway. Why? Because they weren't afraid of death. Why weren't they afraid of death? Would you be afraid of death if you saw Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? If you saw Jesus raised from the dead himself? If you saw Jesus do this and then he said to you, "Here's what they're going to do. They're actually going to kill you, but hold fast. I will, the same as I've been resurrected and I have resurrected, I will resurrect you." Jesus made incredible claims and he proved it with incredible miracles. Is this making any sense to you today? The Bible is unlike any other religious book in history, which makes sense. Natural revelation that there is a designer, there is a God. He spoke it into existence. He gave us consciousness. He breathed life into us, and he wrote on our hearts right and wrong. That's all from the Bible, and it fits with what we see in our human existence. If I were to lay all the religions out in front of us and say, is there any of them there's evidence for? There's only one. One that not only fits with science, but also fits with historical evidence. I'm a Christian not because I sang Kumbaya at church camp and somebody embedded in my brain when I was little so I would grow up and just believe. I'm a Christian who was once a skeptic, who believes in Jesus because it's true, whether I like it or not.